All right, welcome back. Social 30s. This is our first class of economics. And I want to point out that in our digital textbook, we are here on lesson 5. And at the beginning of lesson 5, there's a link that says main notes package for economics unit. So I have this document here, and when you open it up, it'll become that. That's a 10-page summary of economics. So I'm just highlighting that because the textbook does a good job in chapters 4, 6, 8, 12, and 5 talking about economics, but that's a lot of chapters. And I'd like you to read through them, but at the end, you might need a summarized version. That's what this main notes package is. It's a summarized version of economics. Economics is 45% of the year. So taking a quick peek at this document, it chronologically and ideologically talks about the evolution of economic liberalism. So it introduces what economics are, relates back to the spectrum, talks about capitalism, links it to the Industrial Revolution, links it to ideology with Adam Smith, talks about some of the benefits of capitalism, but it also talks about the disadvantages of it, and therefore the need for an evolution towards modern liberalism by embracing some socialism. Looks at some of the abuses that cause that need for the rise of alternatives. And it gives you some of the basic principles of socialism. So it's a nice additional notes package. So that's why I left it there for you. I think I've even printed it and it's included in some of your notes that I gave you in the first wave of notes. So today we're meant to look at lesson 5, and hopefully at the end of today's class you'll be able to connect economics with liberalism. So something new that we're studying, economics, with something old, liberalism. You should be introduced to economic concepts like scarcity and the basic economic questions. You should understand the role that the Industrial Revolution played and how it does have both a positive and negative legacy. And because of the legacy of capitalism through the Industrial Revolution, there's been a struggle between labor and capitalists. Lesson 6 will go on and say these are some responses to classic economic liberalism. So just to jump in and get started, here's a quote by Martin Luther King that you definitely don't need to copy down because it's in the lesson. You can always come back to it. And King isn't often quoted in economics. So when we're talking about economics, we want you to really focus on Adam Smith, Karl Marx. But I think that this is a good quote to get started because it talks about the primacy of economics. A person participates in this society primarily as an economic entity. At rock bottom, we are neither poets, athletes, nor artists. Our existence is centered on the fact that we are consumers because we must eat and have shelter to live. That I would argue that economics is a very important study, especially at a time when people are looking at the governments of the world and saying they're taking on so much debt that it's going to alter generations of future Canadians and Americans and global citizens, to the point that we're going to redefine what it means to own property and to be taxed. So it's a scary time to be alive because of the growth of government. Just in this year alone, the Canadian government spent $10,000 per Canadian combating the effects of the pandemic. $10,000 per Canadian. So if you're a family of 4, then that's $40,000 for your family. Even if you had a CERB check, you may have received 2 or 4 or 6, maybe $8,000. So somewhere money's been lost in the system. And this is not just a one-off. So here we have Martin Luther King, and he's saying, you know what? Poetry is nice, athletics is nice, the most important thing we must consider is we're part of an economic organization. So we're part of a multi-trillion-dollar global economic organization, and money is being transferred from some people to others. Just something to keep an eye on. So, connecting economics to the major theme of the course. Major theme of the course is the role of government and the role of individuals. A guiding principle that governments could well adopt in establishing control over the capitalist system, including industry, labor, and architecture, agriculture, would be that control is needed primarily where there's a conflict between private and public interest. In general, the profit motive of the part of individuals and industries has been in the public interest and has led to progress and economic growth. Government control is needed particularly where the profit motive is distinctly contrary to the public interest. It's a great quote, and the reason why it's a great quote is that in essays, people struggle with getting enough argumentation. All they want to do is evidence, 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 evidence. And what this quote is argumentation. And that if you're writing an essay where you're saying, you know what, individualism is really, really good, but there has to be some times where we practice a little collectivism, where we put a little bit of security ahead of freedom. That's the essence of this argument. It's saying that capitalism has unlocked progress, but it also acknowledges that there's times where capitalism may not be in the public interest, and therefore we might need to regulate capitalism. It's very logical. It's setting yourself up for a comprehensive judicial argument. And the argument that's here fits in with the essay that we looked at just earlier. The argument that we see here, maybe I closed that essay topic already, but it fits in with the, oh, I didn't put it on there either, but it does fit in with the essay from lesson 1 that we are assigned. So that essay prompt is individualism creates division that destroys society. This argument that we're seeing here is saying, no, it doesn't destroy society, it builds society. Economic individualism has created progress. Capitalism has unlocked our potential. The path to a nation's full potential is best achieved through collectivism. It's saying, no, we might need some collectivism during crisis, but the path to our full potential, the wealth of the true nation, is through capitalism. So I would argue that this could be used in response to that. So one of the things that students struggle on is creating an inventory of arguments in favor or against collectivism and individualism. And what we have here is a clear argument in favor of individualism with a little asterisk and saying, yes, when private and public interests are at odds, then we must regulate private interest. So what does that mean? It's in your private interest, your self-interest, to create profit at any cost, which would or could lead to air and soil and water contamination, which isn't in the public interest. So then the government regulates industry and ensures that there's an environmental standard so that we can have both progress, but also ensure that it's sustainable ecologically. It's logical. So we don't see the death of birth. So what else do we have here in the economic unit? It gives us a chance to further contrast individualism and collectivism and see the conflict between those. Man can find meaning in life, short and perilous as it is, only through devoting himself to society. So that first sentence makes me think, oh, this is collectivism. I live for others. The economic anarchy of capitalist society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of the evil. Okay, now it's clearly anti-capitalism, right? It says capitalism's evil. We see before us a huge community of producers, the members of which are unceasingly striving to deprive each other of the fruits of their collective labor, not by force, but on the whole in faithful compliance with legally established rules. So it's suggesting that the government has legally established rules for one group of people to oppress another, to exploit another, and that's why capitalism's evil. So this is sentiment that a Marxist might feel. So what do we have here in these quotes that are in these lessons? These are the building blocks of the essay that was assigned today. Right? This fits with the essay too. This would be someone that would agree with this. Individualism creates division that destroys society, right? Yeah, it does. It destroys society because capitalism is the source of all evil, because it pits people against each other. Destroys society, creates division. It's a huge overlap there. Right? And the next one, private capital tends to become concentrated in few hands, partly because of competition among the capitalists, and partly because technological development and the increasing division of labor encourage the formation of larger units of production at the expense of smaller ones. The result of these developments is an oligarchy of private capital. Today we call them the 1%. The enormous power of which cannot be effectively checked even by a democratically organized political society. So it's saying capitalism is a threat to our security even if we have democracy. And we can see that within democracy, capitalists can often affect change through things like campaign contributions. That in America, capitalist lobby groups end up distorting the will of the people because they can buy influence with politicians. This is true since the members of legislative bodies are selected by political parties, largely financed or otherwise influenced by private capitalists who, for all practical purposes, separate the electorate from the legislature. So we think we have a democracy, but what's in between the people and the elected government are lobbyists representing capitalists. The consequence is that the representatives of the people do not, in fact, sufficiently protect the interests of the underprivileged sections of the population. So they don't protect the 99%, the government's there to protect the 1%. Trump or Biden doesn't care, doesn't really matter. They're both pro-capitalist, they're both pro the elite, right? And it just continues. So this also fits in with the essay. So something to ponder. Economics is a social, I can't spell social apparently, not a physical science. So when you get to university and you study different sciences, economics is a social science. It's still science, there's still mathematics to it, it's still science as well, but what it is a science that gets us to watch and look at and understand people. It's social science. That through economics we can reveal about the nature of mankind. So we have these linked videos from Williams that she's going to take us through the essence of this and that about economics. I'm going to skip that for now. I think that if you're totally lost at the end of the day, then you can always go back and watch the Williams videos. But we're going to keep plowing ahead. So the first word that we need to learn is scarcity. And you already know what it means. But the primacy of scarcity in economics is key. If there was no scarcity, we would have no need for economics. So, hello. So how does that make sense? If we had no scarcity, we would have no need for economics. So if I could simply walk outside and pluck from the ground everything I needed, we wouldn't need an economy. We wouldn't need a market where buyers and sellers meet. If I could think things into creation, then we would need no economy. Because I could just oh, I want a frozen hot chocolate. And there's a frozen hot chocolate. Right? The reason why we have an economy is because we have scarcity. Scarcity means we have a finite amount of resources. That's scarcity. And the problem is we also have a near infinite amount of wants and needs. So I go to West End on the weekend because I love walking around places that are crowded without a mask on, licking handrails and stuff like that, because I'm stupid. But you go to West End, you go store to store, and it's like, man, I could spend millions here. I spent a lot of money at West End. And then you drive to West End, and on the way there, you drive by car lots, and you're like, man, that's a new Porsche car lot. Man, I could buy a Porsche. That'd be cool. Be nice to own an island. Islands are neat. Who doesn't want an island? So the problem is we have scarce resources. There's only so many islands, but we have nearly infinite amount of wants and needs. And therefore we must have an economy that answers how are we going to direct our finite resources towards our nearly infinite wants and needs. And the way you make those economic decisions reveals something about your assumptions about man and your assumptions about the role of government. So we have something called basic economic questions. And the way that the government answers them will tell us a little bit more about the priorities of the government. So we have scarcity. What are some examples? Examples are like rich and poor. You can see that in society. Unfortunately, we have extremely wealthy people and extremely impoverished people. And some people would say that that is natural, and not only is it not unavoidable, but it should be championed. That we need this to motivate that, and we need that to motivate this. That's a very harsh reality, right? To say that the two sides of the economic equation are there to serve as a reminder for each other. But Gandhi would say economics is, or poverty is the worst form poverty is the worst form of violence. So even though some might say that it's natural for there to be disparity in the world, for there to be haves and have-nots, the reality is that the majority of the world are seeing in their locality, they're seeing more and more species and more water and more air becoming endangered, undrinkable, or unbreathable, and therefore the consequences of our economic activities are leading to a moment where we're questioning how much do we have left. So, back to the point, we have basic economic questions. So because we have finite resources and nearly infinite wants and needs, we have to answer these basic questions. So you've done some reading. Anybody know one of the questions? This is like chapter 4. Yes, sir.
What to produce?
What to produce. And the way the state answers it, or if the state answers it, reveals a lot. So in economics, we typically talk about guns or butter. Those are your two options. What to produce? Well, do we produce guns? Do we produce butter? So in North Korea, they produce guns at the expense of consumer goods. And there's a cost to that on the quality of life standard of living of the North Korean citizens. Because the government produces guns over butter, the quality of life standard of living of North Korean citizens is not something that you would want to emulate. They have a life that is not, from our perspective, worth living as much as ours is. So one question is what to produce. In 1928, Joseph Stalin creates a centrally planned organization called the Gosplan, Centrally Planned Committee. And through Gosplan, they answered this question, what to produce. And you may recall from Social 20, if you had the full package, that he observed, I'm just going to close the back door, because it might get loud with lunch. He observed that the Soviet Union was 50 to 100 years behind the great powers of the world, and they must make good that lag in 10 years or be crushed. So he saw the future invasion of his country by maybe Germany, by maybe France, by maybe England, but by the Western nations of the world that were ahead of him and ahead of his country industrially and militarily. So he said, what do we need to produce? We need to produce heavy industry. We need to produce weapons. Why do we need to produce that? Well, if we don't, our nation won't survive. So when Stalin created Gosplan, G-O-S-P-L-A-N, a centrally planned committee, their primary first focus in these 5-year plans was we need to produce things that will ensure the survival of our country. We think that we're going to be invaded, and they were invaded, right? 1941 by the Germans, Operation Barbarossa, but they win that war. How did they win it? Because they produced what was needed before. They produced tanks. They produced heavy weapons. They produced factories. I gave you guys a handout called the Ends Justify the Means that will go into great detail about the number of factories, the number of cities and stuff that Stalin will, through the 5-year plans, create. It's also outlined in this textbook if you wanted a copy, and it's outlined in chapter 5 of your textbook. So the first question is what to produce. And in a centrally planned economy, the answer is what the state decides, right? So what would Karl Marx say they should produce? What's his main thing? If you're going to sum up Marx in one sentence, it's from each according to his ability to each according to his need. So Marx would say we need to produce what we need. So in a Marxist sense, was he loyal to his communist ideology? Well, if you can make the argument that if they don't produce those things, the heavy weapons, then the Soviet Union becomes basically subject to the will of the fascists, and therefore communism is destroyed, then maybe it was justifiable in a Machiavellian way. The ends justify the means. But when you look at North Korea today, what is communism? From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. The people need food. They need food. They're eating trees. I don't think that even though that the regime in North Korea are communist by name, Karl Marx would not approve of what they're doing. So the first basic economic question, what to produce? In a capitalist economy, what's the answer? How do we get the answer? What should we make? Well, we make what the people want. That's what we produce in a capitalist economy. We make what the people want. So you probably don't know this about me. I'm a very private person. I haven't told you guys anything about me. But I used to live in Hawaii, obviously, because I'm an islander. Look at me. And when I lived in Hawaii, I used to sleep on Waikiki Beach, and I made these little tikis, these little guys. I sold them to tourists like you guys. And in the beginning, on Monday, I would sell them for $100 each. Guess what? Most people passed by. I didn't make any money on Monday. Tuesday, dropped the price down to 75, and then 50 by Wednesday, and then by Thursday, I hadn't ate all week, so I was down to $25 each. The problem is nobody wanted them. In a free market, the first question, what should we produce? Should be, what do the consumers want? What can you sell? Should be what to produce. If I make 10 million of these, and I can only sell 3, then I've misallocated scarce resources, because there's a finite amount of resources, for something that is not wanted or needed. What to produce. So in Canada, it's cold. So we have these nice saber tooths. So what should we produce with our finite resources? You should make saber tooths. So go see Mr. Hadlinger and he can hook you up with one of these sweet saber tooths. Makes sense, it's cold out there. And especially cold for guys who have no hair. So it's a product that makes sense. What to produce? Toques. Why are we making them? Because there's bald guys living in a northern climate that need something to cover up the shame of baldness. Can you see how capitalism may be perverting what should be the true answer to number 1 though? What should we produce? What do corporations, after being in my social 10 class, how do corporations answer it? It's whatever can make money. So they're not saying, well, what should we need for the next 50 years? They're like, well, what can sell right now? So sometimes capitalists will answer that first basic economic question in a way that's irrational, irresponsible, that will lead to further ecological damage. Can you think of a product that is currently being produced that we don't need? If you're going to tell me, like, there's products that are irrational and irresponsible, but corporations make them because they're still profitable, what's your product that you use as evidence? Yes?
Cigarettes.
Cigarettes. We can live without them. Even though some people get addicted and it's really hard to live without them. But if we didn't have them, then people wouldn't be getting addicted in the first place. So there's a cost to society. There's a cost in the environment, because butts are very toxic for birds and stuff like that. And that's a product we don't need, but it's a product that's still being sold because it's profitable for corporations. So you can see how even in the first basic economic question, there's inherently a criticism of capitalism and potentially a criticism of command economics as well. So, what to produce? So do you produce something that reflects your individualism, or do you produce something that reflects your values of collectivism? You know, in your ideal society, and that's what your essay should really be, is you hypothesizing what is the economic purpose of society? How do we use our finite resources? How do we do that? So in a free market, the answer is what producers wanting profit think consumers do or will demand. But sometimes they manipulate us, right? Sometimes they create a want that didn't exist. In a command economy, Stalin, through Gosplan, he knew that he had to quickly catch up to prepare for war. And the West had a lead because the Industrial Revolution came to the West first. So what did he need to produce? He needed to produce those heavy arms, those machines, those weapons to survive the coming invasion. So, in a pure Marxist sense, the answer should be what the people need. In Canada, we have a combination of the two, right? What to produce. We have some collectivism, we have some individualism. So we have some things that are nationalized, created by the government, crown corporations, and we have some things that are private companies. Next question is also key to revealing your assumptions and values. Well, how should we produce it? How do we produce it? So I remember being in China in 2008, and I had jet lag, so I was going for a run. And I don't run, but when I'm in other countries I run, because it gives you a chance to see more of the country. So I'm in Beijing, and I was going to do a square. I'm going to go so many blocks in this direction, then go in that direction, that direction, that direction, and then I won't get lost, right? Because it's like 3 o'clock in the morning, it's very dark, and it's Beijing. What could go wrong? So I'm out for this run, and I run by like what I thought was a construction site, but there weren't any like backhoes or any things like that. They had dozens of people working with shovels. How to produce it? Well, in China, sometimes they produce it in a way that employs the most people. It might not be the most cost-effective thing, but it has a benefit because it gives purpose to people. They have 1.4 billion people. That's their advantage and their disadvantage. And therefore, sometimes instead of using machines, we're going to use people. How to produce it? Maybe we should produce it in a way that maximizes jobs. Or capitalists would say, no, screw that. We need to produce it in a way that maximizes profit. So if I can cut half of my workforce and make roughly the same amount of money, why wouldn't I fire them? So sometimes how to produce it is as important as what are we making. How should we make it? How should we make it? Should we make it in a way that makes it more profitable, or make it in a way that creates other benefits to society, like creating jobs? So individualistically, whatever manner maximizes profit. Profit before the environment, oil sands, before human rights, sweatshops, child labor, low wages, third world, I should say, worker exploitation. Maybe before the common good. Maybe we're going to trade with the enemy, like IBM did with the Nazis that we saw in the video, the corporation. Or maybe we're going to put profit ahead of morality and ethics. We're going to sell water at an inflated price in the city of Cucamonga in Bolivia, causing people to riot and leading to people being killed in the streets. But that's okay because we're making more money. So the corporation Bechtel does that. So again, how to produce it is as important as what we're producing. So collectively, you might produce things that maximizes the common good, like I was saying, creating jobs. In places like the Soviet Union, in Soviet Russia, and it wasn't Russia, it was the USSR, so it's Soviet Russia. In Soviet Russia, they would produce things to make sure that they were affordable for everyone. That might mean that the government was subsidizing the essentials, like electricity and water and food, so that no one was living beneath the poverty line. So if their goal is the common good and not self-interest, then how do we make it might be in a way that we're going to make it to maximize the benefit to society, including maybe selling it for less than we could. We're going to have a wage and price control. We're going to have a price control, meaning that we're not going to allow water to be sold for more than this. Even though people might pay more than this, everyone needs water, so we want to make sure there's a price control. Following the French Revolution in Paris, the different bakeries have made a price control on bread in France. You go to Paris, thought maybe this one would be clearer, but it's not. You go to Paris and made it way worse. You go to Paris. Holy, this is this. They probably shouldn't be this close to each other. It's like the end of the world. You go to Paris and there's affordable bread because they don't want people to get violent and cut off the heads of the leaders. All right, we should just move on past that. For now, how do we produce this? As quick as possible. If that means 45 million people die, 45 million people die. Great leap forward. That's communism. So during Mao's Great Leap Forward, millions of people die in these massive projects like building dams because he felt an urgency to prove China to the rest of the world and to accomplish these great things. In Canada, it's mostly the same as individualist perspective. It's all about profit. But there are some government controls, like minimum wage or maximum rent hikes. So there is some government regulation. Third economic question is, well, how do we distribute it? So what to produce, how to produce it, and finally, well, who gets this stuff? Who gets what's made? So there's two basic answers. In a capitalist economy, who gets it? And in a communist economy, who gets it? Well, let's go back to this toque so that I can promote these toques again. Right? Because, so anyways, in a communist society, who should get these? In a Marxist society, who gets these? Pretty simple, don't overthink it. There's one main quote from Marx that we need to know. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Who gets these? Who needs them the most? So you could argue, bald guy needs it the most. So this is good. Now, is Mr. Hetlinger going around the hallways handing these out to people who need them? Not really. He would certainly hook you up if you needed one because he's the kind of guy like that. But really, who gets those grad hoodies that you guys are wearing right now, that you ordered through him? Who gets these toques? Well, whoever's willing to pay for it, right? That's capitalism. So in capitalism, how do we allocate it? How do we distribute it? Whoever's willing to pay for it. In communism, who needs it? Those are two different visions of the economy. One is satisfying need. Who needs it the most? They get the next one. And the other one is allowing for more freedom. Allowing that invisible hand to guide the economy. So that's an introduction to economics. This Presi's going to go a little bit further and talk about some chronological history of economics. It goes back to feudalism. Then there's some photos in it, including children that were used in slave-like conditions during the Industrial Revolution. Then there's going to be some evidence about what was good and what was bad about the Industrial Revolution. So there's some more notes included in this. But let's stop there and make sure that you guys understand the 3 basic economic questions so far before we continue. Any questions about the basic economic questions? So because we have scarcity, we have to make choices, and those are our choices. Pretty simple, right? Pretty straightforward. So we pulled some of the key slides from that Prezi and put them into this document to help you out. But if you're okay with that, then we're going to go to the Industrial Revolution. So within the Prezi, we had that at this point, but I've basically just copied them into this Google document for you. So one of the frustrating things about social studies is the nuances, right? Things are good and they're bad. You know, the current federal Liberal government is good for Canada. It's also bad for Canada. Prime Minister Trudeau's been a good Prime Minister. He's also been a bad Prime Minister. So wouldn't it be easy if we could just say the answer is 4? The answer is not 4. It's complicated. You know, there's things that are happening that are very good. There are things that are happening that are very, very bad. So the Industrial Revolution has a good side, and it has a bad side. And we need to explore both. They're explored in chapters 3 and 4 in the textbook. And how would you ever be tested on this? We love giving you multiple choice questions where we'll give you a photograph or a cartoon, something that shows you some of the negative consequences of the Industrial Revolution, and we try to get you to link it to an ideological perspective. So in chapter 4, we're going to talk about Luddites and Chartists, Marxists and Socialists, and others. We also, how will you be held accountable for this? You'll also be held accountable in the sense that it's common to see it in an A1. We might show you a visual in an A1, much like the third source last week, where it shows you some of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution. But I think one of the things that gets overlooked is that the Industrial Revolution has a good side. It's very easy to be critical of capitalism. But the world has been transformed since the Industrial Revolution in a fundamental, yes, revolutionary way. But at the same time, some of it's been very positive. So Richard Hooker has a quote in the textbook that I talk about in grade 10, but now it's in your actual textbook. And it talks about how, man, I turned right to it, look at me. It talks about how the Industrial Revolution was the most far-reaching, influential transformation of human culture since the advent of agriculture 8 or 10,000 years ago. The consequences of this revolution would change human labor, consumption, family structure, social structure, and even the very soul and thoughts of the individual. That's a pretty powerful statement by Hooker. So the Industrial Revolution is not just how many widgets you could make in an hour, it has changed us ideologically and spiritually. It's made us more individual. It's a pretty powerful case study. On the good side, we see economic growth in an unprecedented way. So if you want to defend capitalism, find some numbers and say this is how much China has grown since they embraced the capitalized global market. Or find some numbers and say this is how much the world economy has grown since the Industrial Revolution. Cheaper consumer products, faster transportation, more urbanization and population will stabilize. Faster communication, increased travel time, decreased production time, we get to specialize. Some would say capitalism is positive because it reflects nature. It's based on survival of the fittest, strongest feed on the weak. Strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must, grade 10 social. It decreased the amount of death. So before the Industrial Revolution, child mortality in places like London was extremely high. 3, 4 out of 5 children would die before the age of 5. 3 or 4 out of every 5, that's incredible, right? 60 to 80% of kids that are born are dying because of the poverty and the lack of what we call now modern medicine stuff that has been unlocked through the Industrial Revolution being promoted by capitalism. But there's some other stuff too. There's worker oppression, but because of the oppression, we'll end up getting maximum hours, minimum wages, environmental regulation, so some good even became out of the bad. So even if you said, well, you know what, the Industrial Revolution is bad because of all that exploitation that happened to children. You're like, well, you know what, you're right, the exploitation was bad, but because of the exploitation, we now have labor laws. We now have government regulating the labor market. We have things like minimum wage. We have things like legislation that protects the age of kids at work. It inspires people like Robert Owen and Karl Marx to come up with new ideologies. But there's a negative side. The Industrial Revolution, clearly during the Industrial Revolution early on, workers were expendable. So it would be very common to see people get killed at work. And unfortunately, those being killed were often children. It led to an environmental problem, like the London smog, the Great Smog of London that killed 4,000 people in the 19th century. And some of those things that are invented, like the Gatling gun, I mean, they're awesome. Fires 900 rounds a minute. But because of the Gatling gun, the American Civil War was very bloody. Because the guy with the Gatling gun in the middle of some trees can mow down hundreds of people, just like using a sprinkler. You don't have to be heavily trained to become a soldier that can kill due to the mechanization of warfare. Leads to long work hours, exploitation of workers, children separated from the families. And we have stories like Iqbal. So Iqbal was a child worker in Pakistan that was sold to the carpet mafia so that his sister could have a nice wedding. And Iqbal was freed. There's some non-governmental organizations freed the children that unfortunately are connected with the WE scandal with the federal liberals. But before they were connected with the Trudeaus, they were saving children from factories around the world. So they went into a factory, they pulled Iqbal out, and when he was freed, he went back to his regular life. He was going to school, riding his bike home, and one day the carpet mafia had a hit on him. They killed him on the way home. So he's a child of 12, killed by the carpet mafia. Why was he killed? Well, he had become an international spokesman, talking to people about the exploitive ways of this carpet industry in Pakistan, trying to convince governments to respond and create change. So one of the responses was the non-governmental organization Craig Kilberger's Free the Children being created. And through Free the Children, Craig ended up pressuring countries like Pakistan to create legislation to protect the children. But we still have things being lost, like the agrarian society is lost forever. And we had this cartoon that you may remember from the quiz. So what was the Industrial Revolution? There's the Hooker quote in your notes there. So it's on page 119 of the textbook. It's in the notes in lesson 5. So you don't necessarily have to copy it down, but when you're thinking about economics and the power, the transformative power of economics, I think he really captures a lot to think about there. Change our very soul, thoughts of the individual. So, we've gone through the good side and the bad side in the Industrial Revolution. We have some related videos we can look at here too. One of the good sides was urbanization. In urbanization, you're going to have these benefits when you move to the city. You're going to have things like parks and schools and hospitals that, because of the Industrial Revolution, created an incentive for people who had moved to cities where the work was. That concentration of population led to the growth of some of the services we take for advantage now. Unfortunately, cities were often overwhelmed, and early on it led to slums where things like cholera quickly spread. But eventually, due to growth in things like immunology, death rate will end up stabilizing and becoming lower. But on a traditional way, people might look at the Industrial Revolution and say it's bad because it attacked traditions, it changed lifestyles, got rid of that sense of belonging together, that shared communal history that you've lived in that village for generations, that you exist through your land, your family, and your church, and you identify with the same church your family's been going to for generations, the same land you've been working for generations. Once we lose that connection to each other, to our church, and to our land, we create a new community in the city, a community where it's easy for Jack the Ripper to become a thing. Jack the Ripper is not a thing in a village of 400. No, who's he sneaking up on? Oh, hey Jack, you know everybody in a village of 400. Jack the Ripper is a psychopathic response to urbanization. It's because in the 19th century, people in London looked at people in the streets and they had no idea who they were looking at. They had lost that connection to each other. So now there's an opportunity to prey upon each other. Because there's fear when you're living amongst people you don't know. So what was lost in the Industrial Revolution? Shared communal existence, shared communal identity. I'm not talking communism, we're talking feudalism, but we're still talking about that idea that it's not me, it's we. We'll see the weakening of family ties as children and adults will both be working. Elderly, instead of seeing as like a privilege, no wonder I'm warm, I still got the toque on. Elderly, instead of seeing them as like, oh man, we get to look after grandma and grandpa, it's like, oh crap, grandma and grandpa would become a burden to us. So because of the Industrial Revolution, there'll be more and more people that abandon their senior parents. You'll have children that will run away because they're like, I'm the only one working in this family, why am I supporting everyone else? I should run away and just have my own family. Or you'll have kids that are abandoned because there's too many to look after. You'll see the gap, the social division between the rich and poor widen, much like you see in the story Tale of Two Cities. You're going to see lots of this, the growth of tenements and tenement society, basically slums. And at the same time that some of the population are living in slums, you're going to see the nouveau riche living in wealth that more than rivals that of the lords of the feudal system. The effects on the children, they're going to get paid less, they're easier to manipulate, they have small little hands, they're going to get the opportunity to work in dangerous mines and stuff. But I think that, history's been great to us. In this picture, you can see the negative side of the Industrial Revolution for kids. That they've lost their childhood. That, at 6 and 8 years old, they're working 14 hours a day. And these are dangerous jobs where probably those people in that photo, probably half of them died on the job before they were your age because of the dangerous conditions that they worked in. So the Industrial Revolution definitely has a grim side to it as well. And that's mentioned at the beginning of chapter 6. So the end result, we're going to see in chapter 4, some people end up questioning the Industrial Revolution and saying, there's too much abuse here. We need to create some changes. And we're going to focus on that next day. There's some specific changes that come up. And most of the time they're just called the Factory Acts. But in the notes here, beginning on page 21, I have very specific ones. If it's in a multiple choice test, these things should be on the page for you. Other than the Factory Act, sometimes they'll test you that. But if you want to include these into your essay, then this is where you need to come back to. So lots of reforms made through looking at the problems of the Industrial Revolution. So what has capitalism done for us? This one's being critical of big business. This one also being critical of big business, saying that it's provided low wages and long work hours. And maybe the solution is unionization. And the idea of unionization comes up on the exam a lot on the multiple choice. Because the people who make the test belong to a union that thinks it's under fire by the government. So they're probably going to subtly throw little pro-union things in. So this is promoting unions of workers all across all of Europe. You're going to get lots of stuff like that. Speaking of union stuff, Mr. Blacker, I'm just recording a lesson right now. Can you call me back at the beginning of lunch? Okay, so 10 minutes? Thanks. Probably thought that wasn't a good time to talk about whatever he needed. Here's a classic cartoon about the power of unions. What did you tell that man just now? I told him to work faster. So this is like the boss of the factory, and this is just a guy coming in to check out the factory. How much do you pay him? $15 a day. Where do you get the money to pay him? I sell products. Who makes the products? He does. How many products does he make in one day? $50 worth. Then instead of you paying him, he pays you $35 a day, tell him to work faster. Huh? Well, I own the machines. How did you get the machines? I sold products and bought them. And who made those products? Shut up, he might hear you. So this is a cartoon trying to promote the idea that it's the workers who are creating the value, not the capitalists. And it's the workers who should be benefiting from the fruits of their labor. One of the main criticisms that Karl Marx had was the idea of theft, that capitalists were stealing the value of labor from the workers during the Industrial Revolution. And that's why he thought that a violent revolution would be necessary. But not everybody agrees with unions. This guy is anti-union, because it's suggesting that if unions are compulsory, like they are with the job I'm in, then if I want to say, you know what, I want to teach in Alberta, but I don't want to belong to a union, I don't have the right to do that. So this cartoon is attacking the idea that unions take away the right to work from people. Whereas this cartoon is pro-unions, because it's saying that we're all trying to get to a better working conditions, but on our own, we're never going to make it up that. It's very daunting. So this individualist, through their individual efforts, are never going to make it to better working conditions. We can infer that they're promoting the unionization. We need to work together as a group. So it's very common to see union cartoons and stuff on the multiple choice. So let's wrap this up with a great summary of the impact of liberalism. Right at the end here. The last 150 years has seen a cavalcade of progress, unlike any in human history. But most of the big gains in living standards have already happened. This was 2016 when it was written. The economic revolution of 1870 to 1970 was unique in human history, unrepeatable because so much of its achievements could happen only once. Electricity, motor vehicles, public transport, public sanitation, infrastructure changed American life, particularly in the cities, virtually overnight between 1890 and 1929. The telephone, the phonograph were part of this set of changes that, when combined, created a network that became the foundation of a global village. The transformation was a consequence of entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship is connected to economic individualism. To illustrate this, Gordon describes a flashback to another age when life and work were risky, dull, tedious, and dangerous. A newborn child in 1820 entered a world that was almost medieval, a dim world lit by candlelight, in which folk remedies treated health problems, and in which travel was no faster than that possible by foot or sail. Gordon suggests that due to improved health care and nutrition, infant mortality rapidly declined, and those millions of extra surviving babies went on to live full, productive lives, transforming the United States into an economic juggernaut. As impressive as the half-century of 1820 to 1870 was, a half-century from 1920 to 1970 can be seen as one big wave of fast innovation and technological change that has not been seen before or since. The productivity of the era was spurred on by the unexpected, seismic political events, the Great Depression and the New Deal. The misery of the Depression promoted the New Deal, which promoted unionization, which in turn made workers more productive. Working hours were reduced, capital had to get smarter, or getting more out of people. The war effort put pressure on manufacturing to become more efficient, while the federal government financed whole new sections of industry that might otherwise not have been come into being. It has been suggested that one of the greatest gifts of the Industrial Revolution, urbanization, has also unleashed more diversification and resilient economies, as great urban centers like London, LA, and New York City have shown the capability to reinvent themselves. Another gift of liberalism has been a new idea, more common with modern liberalism, of social egalitarianism that allowed for the unleashing of the potential of previously underprivileged people. This is related to Napoleon's idea of meritocracy, where he sees value is not predetermined by birth. So that's a summary of the transformative power of the Industrial Revolution. And it probably didn't make a great lot of sense first time through. I'd say tonight, you should probably go back and reread this, make sure you understand it. Tonight, you should look at these cartoons and say, do I get that some people were pro-union and some people were anti-union in response to some of the problems shown through the Industrial Revolution? Do I understand that the governments in England did try to make some changes to protect people from the problems shown in the Industrial Revolution? Do I understand how the Industrial Revolution was both good and bad? Do I understand the three basic economic questions? These are the things we did in Lesson 5. Then, in anticipation of Lesson 6, working through Chapter 4, you can take a peek at these things. Things like, who's Adam Smith, what did he want? Who are the Luddites, who are the Chartists, who's Owen and Marx? Because tomorrow we're going to fly through Lesson 6, and for each one of these people, we've got to be able to say, what is the problem that they see in society? What is the issue that they had with the Industrial Revolution, and what's their solution? So a lot of the ideologies we study this year, we're going to look at tomorrow. So previewing Lesson 6 will be to your benefit. And I think I'll end it there.